available. It will be available to them on demand afterwards. So they won't have the thrill and excitement of being here with us in this very intimate setting when we're talking about Christmas baking from Calabria and all the other good topics that we're talking about. But I am thrilled to welcome Adriana Davies. Adriana has proven to be a very special friend of the Kelowna Canadian Italian Club over the past year. She reached out to us, actually sparked by Dawn's First Family series, congratulating us on the job we've done. And we promptly took that opening and established a relationship with Adriana that has proven to be very fruitful. I could go on about Adriana's bio, but frankly, I don't think we could fit it into the next 90 minutes, but it is a very illustrious bio. What we're going to be talking about tonight in particular, and I know Adriana is going to talk a little bit about two books that she's written, that one focused on this topic and then one where it's included with a bunch of other stories. But what is interesting about this is, and we were chatting a little bit on this on the beginning, the story itself is fascinating, but what was interesting is how the story played out in the press at the time and in the court of public opinion, and what the actual story was. And Adriana has done exhaustive research in that story. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Adriana. I'm going to be running PowerPoint in the background. But Adriana, please, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome.
I'm delighted. I mean, the term paesano in Italian is a very elastic term. So I consider, you guys in Kelowna paesani, and I applaud the excellent work that you're doing in documenting the Italian community history. So, kudos to you, and I'm delighted to be a resource, as and when necessary. Now, I'm going to be talking about Emilio Picariello, and he was a respected and respectable Italian businessman, and who ran afoul of the law when prohibition was implemented. And I wanted to start with this dramatic image, which I used on the cover of the book. And you can see it was taken by, a really famous photographer, Gushel, in the Crowsnest Pass. And when you look at it, you see a respectable individual with his family, very well dressed. And you can see from the little boy wearing the military tunic, it's in, I think it was around 1916, 17. And Emilio bought war bonds. And so, the children would be dressed in Canadian military uniforms, miniature ones, and the girls in nurses' uniforms. So that I want to show that image because there is a very different stereotype that was espoused by the population, not just, from Fernie through the Crowsnest Pass to Lethbridge, which was a bootlegging corridor, but in Alberta, BC, and Canada as a whole. Now, so I'll begin the story, and I'll make some remarks probably for about 15 minutes, and then we'll do the slide presentation. Emilio Picariello and Florence Constable Lassandro were hung on May 2nd, 1923 at the Fort Saskatchewan jail near Edmonton. He was 43 years old and she was 22 years old. The Canadian press published the following account, which was picked up by local papers such as the Lethbridge Daily Herald. Edmonton, May 2nd, 4 o'clock this morning, and the hotel in the little town of Fort Saskatchewan awoke to life. At 4:15, Sheriff Ray, Police Commissioner Bryan, Acting Superintendent J.D. Nicholson, and a stern-faced group of officials walked down to the jail. Shortly after 5 a.m., the first of the death processions formed up, led by Warden Driggs. A hollow knock sounded on the door of the man's death cell. Picariello stepped forth into the dim-lit corridor without a word. 2 warders stepped to his left and right sides. A third stood in front. So they marched along the corridor down a dark and winding stairway from the condemned cells to the prison yard in the rear of the building. The warden leading, followed by the sheriff, then the prisoner with his ring of guards. Behind Picariello walked the devoted friar, intoning the prayers for the dying, and behind him again walked the sinister figure of the executioner. Picariello's eyes followed the flight of the birds for a moment, out into the high-walled exercise yard with a deep ring of many shameful feet worn low in the gravel. Up in a corner of the prison wall, gaunt and ghastly, new against the old gray walls, the awful scaffold reared its head. The rope, yellow and new, swung idly in the vagrant breeze. Aha, the grisly scaffold seemed to laugh. Come here, all you who are tired of life. Here is death, death sudden and sure. Mount, mount, and ride. The press interest in Florence was also huge. Executions of women were rare in Canada. John Kidman, Esquire, Secretary of the Canadian Prisoners' Welfare Association in Montreal, had launched an appeal on her behalf. And after her execution, produced a draft of a booklet that he sent to their lawyer, J. McKinley Cameron, on May 28, 1923, for commentary, called Thumbs Up, Thumbs Down. It began as follows. In ancient gladiatorial style, the women of Alberta turned thumbs down, with the result that in the 20th century of Christianity and in the New World civilization, a young married woman of 22 years of age was placed in the hands of a group of public male officials and dropped from the scaffold on May 2nd, 1923 at Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the manner of death took 11 minutes. The reference to women was a dig at the public stance against a pardon for Florence taken by Magistrate Emily Murphy of Edmonton, who had fought for votes for women, but who felt that equal treatment before the law meant that having been found guilty, Florence should be executed. Murphy wrote to Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, I desire to protest against the pernicious doctrine that because a person who commits a murder is a woman, that person should escape capital punishment. As women, we claim the privilege of citizenship for our sex and accordingly are prepared to take upon ourselves the weight of these penalties as well. Now, the place where Emilio and Florence spent their last days on earth was a model prison built in 1914, 1915. So think about the account in the newspaper, the old walls, you know, the traditional platform where the hanging occurred in the courtyard. In fact, at the Fort Saskatchewan jail, and I've been in that room before the prison was torn down, was in the basement area. So, you know, this was all poetic license, this know-it-all account. So it was a model prison built in 1914-15 for a total cost of $200,000 or 4.1 million in 2018 dollars when I did the calculation. In 1913, the Northwest Mounted Police had moved to Edmonton and the province chose to build a jail on the land. The building of the prison gave Fort Saskatchewan one of its primary industries of the time. The first transfer of 60 prisoners took place in March 1914, and the prison population quickly grew to above 300. The prison was self-sufficient and had a farm, including cattle, as well as a water tower that served not only the prison, but also the town. Although women were accepted from 1917, a women's cell block was only added in 1919. The prison's catchment area was males from anywhere north of Red Deer and women from as far south as Fort Macleod. Basically, in 1988, a new provincial correctional facility was built, and eventually the town of Fort Saskatchewan tore it down. Now, you may well ask, and I'll preempt your questions by posing and answering this question myself, why did the Picariello Lassandro story fascinate me? As an Italian immigrant who came to Edmonton in 1951 as a young child, I think that their immigrant identity intrigued me. My family had experienced discrimination in the 1950s firsthand, myself at school, and my father in his workplace. I wonder whether this played a role in the treatment of Picariello and Lassandro at the hands of the criminal justice system. I spent over 15 years researching their stories, and my work included the curation of a small vignette for the Glenbow's new Western Canadian Mavericks History Gallery in 2005, and the traveling exhibit titled The Rise and Fall of Emilio Picariello, developed for the Fernie Museum in 2016, and the book of the same name, published by Hooligan Books of Fernie in 2016. Virtually from my first encounter with the story in 2002, when working on a website that I titled Celebrating Alberta's Italian Community, which was part of the Alberta Online Encyclopedia, I knew that there was more to the story than the commonly held view that an Italian bootlegger and his mistress shot a law-abiding Alberta provincial police officer, Stephen Lawson, while they were contravening the Prohibition Act. I mean, that's how they've been treated in history. And even the opera Philomena. In order to discover more, I read all of the preliminary hearing and trial records held at the Glenbow, case records, Alberta Provincial Police personnel files, and other records of the Provincial Archives of Alberta. Also the material in the bootlegger literature, newspaper accounts of the crime, as well as fictionalized accounts. In 2005, I also met with some members of the Picariello family for the first time. As a lover of crime fiction, I realized that their story was worthy of being treated as a cold case, and all the information available reviewed with the purpose of arriving at the truth. Were they rightly hanged for a heinous crime, or was it a terrible miscarriage of justice? The exhibit in the book provide the evidence that I discovered, and you can make up your mind as to whether the evidence is compelling or not. The protagonists in this tragedy all had one thing in common. Emilio and Maria Picariello, Florence Costanzo Lassandro, and Stephen and Maggie Lawson were all immigrants. The Picariellos and the Costanzo family were Italians, among the millions who came to find a better life in the US and Canada. The Lawsons were British. Their very countries and of origin determined their ranking as desirable citizens. Italians only suitable for laboring jobs, such as the building of the CPR and branch lines, mine work and construction trades. The British were the ruling class and were captains of industry, police, lawyers, teachers, and other professionals, as well as good farming stock, the best type for populating the new land. Emilio Picariello was born in November 1879 in Capriglia, Avellino, Campania, Italy, which is near Naples, and not in Sicily, as the bootlegging literature would have it. And, publications as late as the 1980s had him as Sicilian. His father was a tenant farmer, and he and his older brother were taught to read and write by local nuns. He immigrated to the US in 1899, arriving at Ellis Island and settled in Allentown, as did his future wife, Maria Manucci. He heard of work in Canada and, like many other Italian immigrants, went to Toronto and started a small grocery store, which prospered. The couple married in 1904 and they had 2 children, son Stefano, Steve, in 1905, and daughter Angelina Rose, Julie, in 1907. In 1911, the family moved to Fernie, where he went to work in the macaroni factory owned by G. Marinero, who eventually moved to Lethbridge to set up another factory, leaving Picariello in charge. Picariello was able to take over the business, as well as setting up a range of others, including a cigar and ice cream manufactory. The couple had 4 more children, Carmine, Mario, Luigi, Charles Albert, and Florence Eleanor, named after Florence Lassandro. Around 1914, Emilio became the Fernie representative of the Polack Wine Company and began to collect and buy used bottles for sale to brewers and distillers. Eventually, he established a monopoly and advertised as E-Pick, the Bottle King. Florence was barely literate, and a marriage was arranged for her by her parents with Charles Sanfidele, who worked for Emilio in the Picariello factory and was a close friend. They married on October 16, 1915, and almost immediately left for Pennsylvania, where Charlie hoped to find better paying work. This did not occur, and they returned to Fernie, where Charlie continued to work for Emilio, and Florence became a close friend of Maria Picariello and helped her with the care of the children. And as I mentioned, the couple's last child, Florence Eleanor, was named in her honor. Prohibition became law in Alberta on July 1st, 1916, and in April 1918, interprovincial shipment of liquor was prohibited. In the US, the Volstead Act, which was passed in 1919, expanded prohibition across the country and created a much larger and more lucrative market for Canadian bootleggers. This was too good a business opportunity, excuse me, for entrepreneurial individuals to pass up. The stakes were high and a great deal of money could be made. Some families used their ill-gotten gains to build empires, such as the Bronfman family. I mean, they started out as bootleggers in Saskatchewan, and a brother-in-law was murdered, you know. So you can see that the Bronfmans did well. In January 1918, Picariello bought the Alberta Hotel in Blairmore and moved there from Fernie with his family to run the hotel as well as his other businesses. He became an extremely successful bootlegger, running illegal alcohol across the Alberta-British Columbia border, through the Crowsnest Pass, and over the foothills from Sweetgrass, Montana. He also became the sole agent for the Lethbridge Brewery and could legally sell near beer or temperance beer with an alcohol content of just over 2%. Picariello bought 2 Model T Fords, later replaced by McLaughlin Buicks, which were much more powerful, for his bootlegging operations. He built a basement under the Alberta Hotel to facilitate loading and unloading of cases of liquor. It is also said that he tunneled underground passages under the hotel and adjacent roadway to hide his stock. Whether that's fact or fiction, who knows, but there certainly was a basement. On September 21st, 1922, police officers from Blairmore, Coleman, and Lethbridge mounted an operation to entrap Picariello based on a tip from a police informant, a rival bootlegger. The ringleaders were Alberta Provincial Police Sergeant James O. Scott and Sergeant John James Nicholson. They were joined by Constable Stephen Lawson, who had left his post as police chief in Fernie to join the Alberta Provincial Police in charge of the Coleman detachment. That was in spring of 22. Picariello, his mechanic, J.J. McAlpine, and Picariello's son, Steve, who was 16, undertook a liquor run to Fernie based on a liquor order from Rogers & Co. Limited, Lethbridge, dated September the 14th, 1922, to deliver 12 bottles of whiskey to Harry Rose, Cutbank, Montana. And around 4 p.m., we're driving back to the Alberta Hotel in Blairmore from Fernie, where they picked up the booze. Fernie had a huge number of liquor provisioners. When Picariello was challenged, he signaled to Steve to turn around and head for BC to save the load in his car. Driving through Coleman, he was ordered by Constable Lawson to stop and refuse. Lawson fired and shot him in the hand. Lawson pursued Steve into BC, but eventually had to give up because of car trouble. Incidentally, it was illegal to cross the border in pursuit of a supposed criminal. Around 7 p.m. that evening, Picariello, accompanied by Florence Lassandro, went to the Alberta Provincial Police Barracks in Coleman and was involved in a confrontation with Constable Lawson, who died as a result of a gunshot wound. After the shooting, Picariello and Lassandro fled Coleman and returned to Blairmore, where they went into hiding. They were both arrested the next day as a result of a huge manhunt involving the Alberta Provincial Police, RCMP, and local police. They were charged with murder. Alberta Provincial Police Sergeants Scott and Nicholson were in charge of their interrogation and evidence gathering, and neither took notes of these activities or had witnesses present. In fact, when Florence was interviewed, and this was in the Frank Sanatorium, the officer waited until the matron had left to interview her. So, I mean, there were all sorts of contraventions of accepted legal practice. At the time of his arrest, the Lethbridge Herald estimated Picariello's assets at $200,000. On September the 25th, Constable Lawson received a Masonic military funeral in Fort Macleod, the largest funeral in the district. And the town flags were flown at half-mast. He had served with the Northwest Mounted Police and had also distinguished himself during the First World War. He was a war hero. A preliminary hearing was held at the Coleman Opera House on the 2nd and 3rd of October, and the actual trial was held in Calgary and lasted for 5 days, from November 27th to December the 1st, 1922. Picariello and Lassandro were tried jointly and were found guilty. They were defended by well-known Calgary barrister J. McKinley Cameron, who was assisted by Sherwood Herkmer of Fernie. No defense witnesses were called, and the defendants did not take the stand. The defense was based on points of law, in particular, the lack of any records of prisoner interrogations. Cameron lodged an appeal to the Supreme Court of Alberta, and because of one dissenting opinion, was able to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. And I'll read you an extract from a deposition dated 8th of October, 1922 by Philip Martin Christophers, who was a member of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta and resided in Blairmore. He requested that the trial venue be moved from Fort Macleod. I mean, as you can imagine, they weren't going to get a fair hearing in Fort Macleod, which was a Northwest Mounted Police town. On the evening of Friday, the 22nd day of September, 1922, after it became known throughout the past towns that the accused Picariello was arrested, people from all the surrounding towns flocked into the town of Blairmore, where Picariello was arrested and formed into mobs and excited groups. And I made it my business to circulate among the various mobs and groups and noted that the excitement of the people thereof observe the great hostility towards the accused Picariello, and then form my opinion and to verify, believe that the groups would have united and taken mob action against Picariello had it not been for the fact that within a short time it became public the police had surreptitiously taken the prisoner Picariello out of the district, and as it became known later, into the Lethbridge Judicial District for safekeeping against the actions of the crowds. That night it was necessary to put special guards to protect the property of Picariello in the said town, as it was feared that the mob would burn the same. And I know also that steps were taken to guard the surrounding property by reason of the fear of the owners thereof that their property would be destroyed if the mob set fire to the Picariello property. Now, imagine Maria Nina, she was called, who was illiterate. Basically, her son Stephen, when Picariello was in prison, did the translations for her and acted on her behalf. And he and Julie, looked after the hotel and other property. So just an aside. Now, in terms of the grounds for the appeal, these are some of the points that their legal counsel, McKinley Cameron, made. Was the jury panel legally and properly constituted by reason of these 10 jurors being added to the panel, or was it improperly constituted for this or any other reason? I mean, they were all men and they were all of British descent. Were the various statements or any of them alleged to have been made by the defendants as set out in the proceedings inadmissible by reason of the Crown not having laid a proper foundation by providing that they were voluntary, or were they or any of them inadmissible for any other reason? No notes were taken. So it was unknown. The defendants, having been promised that whatever they might say would be taken down in writing, and this not having been done in any case, were these statements or any of them on that ground rendered inadmissible. When Detective Scott gave evidence of his search of certain rooms alleged to be the rooms of the prisoners, should he have produced all the articles found in these rooms, such as pictures and clothing, instead of giving secondary evidence in regard thereto? In view of the failure of the officers to take down statements of the prisoners, and in view of the contradictory evidence of what the statements were, should I have cautioned the jury in regard to this evidence, or were my instructions proper and sufficient in that respect? Should I have instructed the jury that the acts, conduct of each prisoner was not evidence except against himself or herself? In instructing the jury, should I have told them that they should consider all and every part of the evidence separately against each accused? Did I err in failing to instruct the jury that they might acquit one and convict the other? Did my charge as a whole, or any part or parts of it, violate the provisions of subsection 5 of section 4 of the Canada Evidence Act? And may the jury have understood that the prisoners, or either of them, had the right to testify and failed to do so? Did I sufficiently instruct the jury on the laws of justifiable homicide? Was my direction to the jury on the question of self-defense sufficient in law? Was it misdirection in charging the jury that if they found the plea of self-defense established along the lines which I have indicated, that they were entitled to return the verdict of not guilty in respect to the one to whom that plea applied? I mean, these are all technical, but they have to do with the fact that these two Italian immigrants, and he, the king of the bootleggers, they were stereotyped, and they did not have the protections of the law that they would have had if they had been British. And of course, there were lots of British bootleggers. Let's be clear. I mean, the Italians were a minority. Now, what's interesting is, and I'll read you from a letter which was a breakthrough that I made in researching the book. I had looked through all of the legal documents because McKinley Cameron's papers are in boxes at the Glenbow. And I had missed this crucial letter. And it's a letter from Sherwood Herkimer, who assisted Cameron. And he provides information about the rival bootleggers and sting operation. He says, I was able to identify the rival bootleggers who acted as police informants as a result of discovering, well, sorry, this is me, the 4-page letter from Sherwood Herkimer to Cameron dated November the 13th, 1922. Herkimer took on the role of data gathering and even hired an ex-Alberta provincial police officer to look into bribes to prominent figures by Picariello. Herkimer identified Jack Wilson, a 26-year-old recent immigrant from Ireland, who Picariello assisted in getting into the bootlegging business. He is said to have lent him $1,000 to do this. And the much more powerful figure, Mark Rogers, who is a Lethbridge-based car dealer, hobby farmer, and owner of the liquor supply company Rogers & Co. Limited, and the King's Liquor Export Company in Fernie. They were referred to as Mr. Big and Mr. R. Wilson prospered and lived to a ripe old age. Rogers died as a result of an accident, quote unquote, handling his Winchester pump gun around 2:14 a.m. on September the 30th, 1924, at his residence in Lethbridge. This was 2 years and 9 days after the murder of Constable Lawson. And so I'll go back to that. I think now we'll go ahead with the PowerPoint. So you've had the opportunity to read, and I wanted you to see the marriage certificate, relatives. I mean, there were a number of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and several of them gifted material to the Glenbow. And so there you have the marriage certificate, 1904. And they had 2 ceremonies, one in the US because her family, Maria's family, was in the US, and also in Toronto. Can we move to the next slide? And there's the Alberta Hotel in Blairmore. And you can see Maria with her daughter Julie, and you can see that you know, they're middle class in terms of their attire, and as I said, he was a successful businessman. Actually, I think that rather than 1920, I think it is 1918, and the 1920 dating is the Glenbow's dating. And as I mentioned, his business was headquartered in the hotel. The family lived in the hotel and also ran a clothing store and bar. And their partner in the clothing store was a former Alberta provincial police officer. Carry on. And there is the front of the hotel, and you can see the sign for the business. He had purchased the hotel from Fritz Sick, who had started a number of breweries, including the famous Fernie brewery, and then went on to Lethbridge. And he survived and thrived like the Bronfmans, although there were some shady dealings during the Prohibition era. Okay, next. And there's a wedding party, and you can see that they're all well dressed. No different from a wedding party of British Canadians. And Stephen can be seen. I go back to that earlier family photo. And it said that during the Spanish flu pandemic, the Alberta Hotel housed patients. And Julie can be seen to the left of the bride and Stephen to the right of the groom. Next. And of course, to understand the establishment in Alberta, you have to understand the role of the Northwest Mounted Police and the Alberta Provincial Police, because a number of Northwest Mounted Police officers went into the Alberta Provincial Police, as did, soldiers coming back from the front. So this is a mess in Fort Macleod. There is the Provincial Police detachment at Blairmore, and it's that little house-like structure, and that they served a number of purposes. So they were the residences of the constable or other officer and his family frequently, as well as the jail. Next, there is the Coleman, and it's a historic site. Next, there are provincial police on guard duty. Commissioner Bryan is Inspector Brentsley and Corporal Sergeant Major circa the 1920s. And they had to patrol from the Saskatchewan border, that central span of Alberta, to the BC border. And they, it's a huge area to patrol, treacherous terrain. And also they didn't even have enough vehicles. And also this area had voted against prohibition. So ordinary people did not, support the police. Next, searching for liquor at the barrier. That's the provincial barrier. And so those were the kind of vehicles that the police had. They were not as powerful as the McLaughlins that the bootleggers drove. Next, there's the prohibition poster. And of course, the root of prohibition was the social gospel movement that looked at social ills and tried to get at the root of them. And of course, they viewed liquor as the root of all evil. And of course, this was espoused, the social gospel movement, largely by the Protestant churches in North America. And in the book, I talk about, the Fernie, for example, and Crowsnest communities. You would get, preachers coming through, a number of them from the US, who were preaching, that liquor traffic must go. Although, for example, the Fernie miners made a motion that mining was thirsty work and that miners should be exempt from this. So it gives you an idea of the climate and the attitude towards booze. Next. There's the Grand Union Hotel in the Crowsnest Pass, and hotels were involved. It was the liquor trade was a backdoor trade. They served prohibition beer, but you made your money through bootlegging. Next. And of course, trains. And, then there were all sorts of networks of trains, which we don't have anymore. But, and that connection between the US and Canada, which we didn't have, and the Spokane Flyer, which of course ended up in Minneapolis, St. Paul. That booze clearly was hidden in the train, and railway staff made extra money through the liquor trade. Next. There's Commissioner Willoughby Charles Bryan, Alberta Provincial Police. He was in the military before he became commissioner. Next. And there's Maria and Florence. Again, very modest looking, because the media, of course, treated her as a whore. She was said to be either Picariello's mistress, or she was the mistress of 16-year-old Steve. I mean, she was 22. So you can imagine how Maria, and most of these women were incredibly straight-laced. Would she have condoned her having an affair with either her husband or her son? And Florence did have marital difficulties with Charles, and did move in with the Picariellos in the hotel. And Maria had had a difficult pregnancy, so she helped by looking after the children. Next. There's Constable Stephen Lawson. And he was the police chief in Fernie. He was hired by Brian because, of course, Fernie was where all the liquor came from, that other than the stuff that was made in stills, the moonshine. But Picariello and others dealt with the good stuff. Next. There's the police photo of the crime scene, a street in Coleman. And just to go back, Constable Lawson later that day spoke to Picariello and told him to bring his son in, otherwise there would be trouble. And in the court documents, you'll see that supposedly, Alberta Provincial Police, the local police, and also RCMP officers who testified said that Picariello threatened violence because he didn't know, whether his little son was alive or dead. In fact, Steve had made it safely to BC and had contacted his father and told him that he'd been shot in the hand. Next. They used police dogs, and these had been introduced, and the ones that they used were 7 bloodhounds from the Lethbridge Division. RCMP from the Lethbridge Division also were involved in the manhunt. And I should mention that during the First World War, the RCMP got out of local policing in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and both provinces had to set up their own provincial police. So you had 3 levels of police involved in the manhunt. Next. There's Jonathan Houghton, Chief of Police of Coleman, again of British stock, and he too assisted in the sting operation. Next. There's the arrest warrant for Florence Lassandro. The spellings all vary. Murder 1, Constable Stephen Lawson. In fact, Florence turned her, after they left the crime scene in Coleman, Florence went to stay with a friend, and Emilio hid in so-called Italian town in Blairmore, and they never spoke to each other again after that. And that's an important detail. And Florence turned herself in, was interviewed alone, and confessed that she shot Lawson in self-defense. Basically, what happened was that they went to Coleman, and one of Lawson's children, a daughter, was playing outside, and they asked her to get her father. Lawson came out, and he ended up standing on the running board of the vehicle, and she testified, this young child, that her father was hugging Mr. Pick, and that then, of course, guns went off. Now, if he was hugging Mr. Pick, and both Picariello and Lassandro were carrying weapons, that you would have thought that Stephen Lawson would have been shot in the chest. In fact, he was shot in the back. Now, if he felt threatened, would he have turned his back on these two dangerous types? Picariello claimed that there was a shooter in the alley, and there were multiple shots. No one else other than Lawson's little girl saw anything. Next. And there is Picariello. And, he was a short, stocky individual. Was he a violent thug? There's no evidence of that at all in terms of his background. But the press immediately branded him as a criminal and Lassandro as his accomplice. And the mistress of his, Steve turned 17 during the trial, and his father in a letter apologizes for forgetting his birthday. Next. It gives you an idea of the headlines. Picariello in cells at Lethbridge, alleged slayer. Constable Lawson submits weekly. Woman also arrested. What Herkimer discovered was that, and in that 5-page letter that I referenced, was that Mark Rogers actually drove with RCMP officers from Lethbridge into the Crowsnest Pass area, and so that there were many people. I mean, it's like a Keystone Cops setup in the dark with all of these people bearing arms. And that, in fact, Picariello was driven to Lethbridge in Mark Rogers' vehicle with his police escort. Next. There is the mugshot of Florence, and she did capture the attention of the media, and that, I mean, she was either a whore or an innocent. And the best known account, which is a fictionalized account, is The Bootlegger's Bride by Jock Carpenter, who vilifies Picariello and paints him as a criminal, and Florence is totally innocent. And when she wrote the book, she had interviewed Brother Fidelis Chicoine. He wasn't a priest, he was a religious brother who visited Florence at Fort Saskatchewan prison and became her confidant. Next. Those are the floral tributes for Constable Stephen Lawson in Fort McLeod. And according to her letter, the biggest bouquet was sent by Rogers, and he's Mr. R, not Mr. Big, my error. And he also donated to a fund to assist the family of Constable Lawson. Next, there is the funeral, and you can see the police pipe band in full regalia. Next, there they are on the way to the burial. And you can see it's a pretty impressive funeral cortege. And, you know, they were all key members of the British establishment. Next. There's Defense Counsel Cameron. And he was incredibly high-powered. I mean, he was a King's Counsel. And he had so why was his defense of Picariello and Lassandro so weak and based on points of law? Now, there are letters in the file where, you know, one a lawyer from Red Deer that would have given very prejudicial testimony against members of the Alberta Provincial Police who were involved in the sting operation, and you know, accusing them of perjury. But he never called on any witnesses, and my sense is that he knew this was a case that he couldn't win. The Attorney General was there from the get-go, I mean, and shouldn't have been in the court. I mean, everything was done wrong. And, you know, if the case were tried today, it would have been thrown out of court for all sorts of violations that Cameron pointed out in his appeal document. And so it was Cameron who referred to the race card in court in Calgary. And the press speculated that Picariello was a member of the Black Hand Criminal Society, you know, which had been in Fernie, but prior to this event, and Picariello was definitely not involved with the Black Hand. And in notes and everything and other materials in the legal files, Cameron generally believed in his client's innocence and believed the assertion of the shooter in the alley. Next. There's A. McGillivray, who was also King's Counsel, who was the Crown prosecutor. And they set the trial date in Calgary because they wouldn't have got a fair trial. They didn't get a fair trial in Calgary, but they certainly wouldn't have done so either in the Crowsnest Pass area or Fort McLeod. He later ran for political office and served as a member of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta and served as leader of the Alberta Conservative Party. Next. There's the courthouse. And the media showed that the courthouse was packed. And you can see some of the headlines. As I said, it was a co-celeb. Cameron referred to the race card. The prosecution called 40 witnesses. There were no defense witnesses. Next, there's Picariello's sketch, where he talked about a shooter in the alley. In September, you know, it would have been relatively dark. And Picariello mentions that when they drove into Coleman, he saw that bastard from BC. And so, you know, I speculate whether that bastard was, you know, the so-called Mr. Big. Next. And just to give you a sense of the tenor, because, you know, when you read personnel files for APP officers and other correspondence, one is staggered by the racism. This is the police report. The shooting of Constable Lawson was the outcome of a chase at Picariello's son during the afternoon of September 21st. Sergeant Scott, Constables Day, and Lawson endeavoring to capture him with a carload of liquor. The chase headed towards BC from Blairmore, and Lawson was instructed to intercept him at Coleman, which he endeavored to do and fired 2 shots in the air to warn him. Well, you think if you fired 2 shots in the air, how come one hit the hand of this young man? And they weren't even convinced that he had the booze. I mean, this was all based on assumption. The father, upon hearing this, swore he would get Lawson and every policeman in the pass if his son had been shot. He knew before going to Coleman to see Lawson that his son had not been shot, as he had been in telephonic communication with him from Michelle. In fact, it was from Natal, and had told his father that Lawson had shot him in the hand. This apparently was the motive for the murder of Lawson. The Lassandro woman, it is alleged, was very fond of the young Picariello, and this was probably the reason why she accompanied the father to Coleman and admitted that she had used a gun and shot Lawson. Although only one gun was found, there was indisputable proof that the 2 were used. Only 1 bullet took effect, and that was fired from a .38 caliber revolver. Either one of them may have fired the fatal shot. Next. And this is the extract from a deposition. I've already read you that, so we'll go on. There is this mysterious little postcard, which this individual claims to be the shooter in the alley. And there is an individual who claims to have found a revolver of the appropriate caliber in a creek in Coleman, and that it has the initials MR on it, you know, which again is intriguing. But of course, that isn't in a museum, it's in private hands, so I had no access to that. Next. There is Fort Saskatchewan Jail, the model prison, and not, you know, the jail as described in the creative media account. Next. There is the sensational 11th hour confection. Now, what's interesting is that throughout Picariello's stay in the Fort Saskatchewan prison, his wife didn't visit him. She was not very well, and he didn't want her to go to visit him. The family believes that Steve and his younger brother, Carmine, did visit, but there is correspondence, you know, which is very haunting. But the Alberta Provincial Police continue to put pressure on Florence to state categorically that Picariello had shot Lawson, and that he had told her to confess because a woman is unlikely to be found guilty of murder. And so one of the things that in the rebuttal letter that I referred to at the beginning of my presentation, that Cameron insists that Picariello didn't have that kind of knowledge of the law, and that the last time he saw Florence is when they parted company. So that the notion that he at any time was able to tell her that, it was impossible. The Alberta Provincial Police did get to Florence's mother, and that she is said to have said that Mr. Pick, he lied and lied, and of course there is no evidence of this. Next. And Mark Rogers. I chose there on the family's ancestry site, there is a stunning picture of Mark Rogers sitting in his study with a gun rack behind him. And he's got a rifle that he is priming, which is incredible to see that, because then, of course, the Lethbridge Daily Herald reported on in the coroner's inquest on his death. And, now what's interesting is that, as I've said, he ordered the booze from Picariello, and I found the liquor order. I didn't include it as one of the slides in the file, and that I feel that he committed suicide. I mean, he was a skilled marksman. How could he possibly, have his gun misfire or be cleaning it when it was, when it has a shot in it? And what is interesting about that open verdict was that everyone was aware that the insurance policy would not pay out to his wife if it had been declared a suicide. So they chose the open verdict. But the timing is just so interesting. It was just 2 years and maybe 10 days after the murder of Lawson. So whether in fact Rogers did shoot Lawson in the back, as a number of people were shooting. There were at least 5 or 6 shots that were heard by people in various premises around the APP headquarters in Coleman. Next. There is a death warrant signed by Attorney General J. Brownlee, who I said was involved, went to the trial, attended every day of the trial. He was also involved with the Alberta Provincial Police in terms of their solicitation of the brother who was Florence's confidant, trying to get her to turn on Picariello. Next. There is the defense of Picariello that I referred to, that letter to John Kidman, Secretary of the Canadian Prisoners Welfare Association. They wanted an end to capital punishment. And Cameron sets out a series of falsehoods, among them being the one that Picariello told her to plead guilty because they would not hang a woman. Next. Now, this is the story that I didn't have at when I finished the book. I had visited the graveyard in 2005 because the family had told me. And I had actually got the location. And when I visited the graveyard in 2005, there were no grave markers. And so this was a very interesting story that arose out of the traveling exhibit, that when it was at the Galt in December of 2017, Justice Kevin Feehan was trying a case down there, and other fellow justices said that he should go and see the exhibit at the Galt. And when he saw it and saw the text panel that referred to the unmarked graves, he actually, when he got back to Edmonton, he contacted me and he said the graves were not unmarked. And of course, there is this incredible case of the will of William Conley Sr., founder of Conley and Conley McKinley funeral homes in 1908, who had been the undertaker summoned to bury Picariello and Lassandro in St. Joachim Cemetery in Edmonton, and who was really touched by their plight and believed in their innocence, so much so that he left money in his will. But because there was a contesting of the will, it was actually not probated until much after his death. And so it was Kevin Feehan who then, acting on behalf of the family, who saw that the graves were marked in 2011. And you can see that Picariello is misspelled. And I actually gave a lecture after the launch at the Fort Saskatchewan Museum at Graveside that was attended by members of the Picariello family and members of the Conley family. Next. And we're done. It's a wrap. Q&As now.
So yeah, if anyone has a question for Adriana, just unmute yourself and ask, or if you'd prefer not to ask verbally, you can just enter it in the chat window and I can pose it for you.
Well, Adriana, I'd like to start by saying thank you very much. This is very intriguing. I haven't gone looking for mysteries like this in our own families here, but I have come across a few court cases and trials. And what I have found is that our first ancestors here worked with our First Nations people very closely, and they lived off the land. They did the fishing of the kickanee, the coconut, the salmon in the creeks. They harvested stuff on the roads. And about the 1920s or so, a lot of them start getting brought to court for these things, doing these illegal activities. Living freely off the land, I guess, wasn't really liked anymore. The game wardens were hired. Numerous cases there were some charges made for hunting out of season and things, but most of the charges were thrown out. There were great arguments, and the papers have indicated great arguments of, were the fish speared by gaffs or were they hooked by hook, like supposed to have, and it looked like one thing to one person, one the other. The judges threw most of the cases out. And I think I see it as a sort of a prejudice thing, that there's all these game wardens hired by basically the British influence of starting the orchards here in our area against all the immigrants, not just the Italians, but the immigrants in general that came here living off the land. And these stories are just coming out now. These wasn't passed down, and I didn't know anything about them before. But I am hearing stories that our ancestors here did all these things was they thought was quite natural, just living off the land like the First Nations people were, and they lived quite closely with them, but then getting penalized for it later.
Yeah, no, talk about that after, but I'll begin by saying that, the supposed criminality of Picariello and Italians. I read about 20 years of police records in Fernie, including under Police Chief Lawson. Very, very few Italian cases, nothing of any major criminality. It would be misdemeanors. And I also read the court records. And again, nothing. I mean, Picariello was, there were other prominent Italians. I mean, he would have been newer. I mean, there were others who were there from the 1880s, Philip Carosella and others. I mean, they're the founding families of Fernie before, the miners came, and Carosella had a hotel. I mean, all of this stuff. They had liquor stores as well. I mean, they were established businessmen. So that this notion of criminality and the Black Hand does come in. I mean, and of course it is an American import, and it's the Black Hand from Spokane, because there are actually some trials and some people were found guilty, but they were not from the Canadian communities. They were from Spokane, and that relationship with Spokane and the criminality, of Italians in the U.S. I mean, that can be questioned as well. But the Black Hand was really an extortion society, and they threatened damage to your business, and then kidnappings and murder. And at Revelstoke, there actually was a murder. I mean, so it was around, but there is, and that if Philip Carosella and his brother were supposedly threatened. I think this was in 1909 in Fernie, but there's no association, with Picariello. So I think it's the race card, it's the association with criminality, it's the media taking on, and it was about 1905, I think, when the Black Hand emerged, and the other, and eventually the mafia in New York and other areas of the US, and the Canadian media then picked it up. And whether, in fact, there was a mafia Black Hand, and then later the mafia presence in Canadian communities. I mean, Montreal, Toronto, etc., let alone, other communities across the country is really open to question. So I think there is that aspect of that, the criminality, which is clearly racist based on the police and court records that I've looked at in Fernie. And then in terms of living off the land, I mean, we know that a lot of the immigrants were from rural areas in Italy. They all hunted and fished if they had access to fish. My father hunted. I mean, and others in Grimaldi, we all had lands, surrounding agricultural properties and woodlands and so on. So it was natural for them to do so. And in terms of my book, Sojourners to Citizens, I mean, of course, I deal with the histories of the Italian communities and, in Banff, Crowsnest Pass, Jasper, the Coal Branch, Nordegg. They were all great hunters. But there is one case that I refer to, but it's a more contemporary case where it's an Italian family that were really big game hunters and flew in parties from the US and so on, and hunted out of season without appropriate licenses. But in Alberta, I haven't seen anything parallel to what you're describing. But I think that in terms of the law, it was racialized. And so therefore, it doesn't surprise me, you know, the accounts that that you're providing to me. But and in terms of the relationship with Indigenous people, certainly there are some important instances of the close relationship of Italians with Indigenous people, certainly in the early part of the century. Not intermarriages, I mean, as in the Francophone community, but certainly some relationships. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yeah, very much, yeah.
Okay.
Adriana, I've actually just got a follow-up question to Dawn's. We've talked a little bit before about how the different immigration patterns here in the Okanagan were a little bit different than other areas. And certainly we actually have representatives of two of the earliest families on this call. We have Marie Sperling, who is from the Casorso line, and of course, Dawn's family, the Ramponi. So you did have an established agricultural core in the mission, but from about 1912 on, I mean, in your book, you talk a lot about sojourners, and then there was definitely an influx of sojourners coming into the Okanagan, either to work on irrigation works up in the Belleville area, or eventually the Kettle Valley Railway. And certainly in the editorials in the time, there is a backlash against these Italians coming into what at that time was a very British community. And I wonder if what Dawn was talking about is a little bit of a reaction to those sojourners coming in kind of from about 1912 through to really the launch of the First World War.
Well, I mentioned that, and this will bear out what you've just said, that you know, in terms of the work in you know, south eastern BC, you know, which was the area that I looked at, that you know, that there were a lot of Italians who went involved in railway construction, and then you know, a number of them set up small businesses. And then, of course, you've got the rich agricultural land in your area, which you didn't. I mean, so there were fewer homesteaders in Alberta than there were in your area. But I think that what hardened attitudes against Italians in BC, based on the literature that I looked at, was that at the beginning of the First World War, Italy dithered as to who it was going to side with. And eventually they sided with the Allies. However, in the public opinion, and I mean, and in the book, in the Picariello book, I actually list the people who enlisted, il seno degli emigranti, you know, in the First World War, you know, Italians who went back to Italy to serve. So there, and others then who were established and joined the Canadian Armed Services. However, because of that dithering as to whether to side with the Allies or not, by the end of the war, Italians were lumped in with enemy aliens. And certainly in the Fernie areas, in the coal mining communities, there were Italians who were viewed as enemy aliens. So that then erodes any, so the race card, enemy aliens, I mean, you know, you're blackballed, right?
Well, the sheer numbers too, like in the Belleville Canadian work camp, those irrigation projects, a camp of 120 people, 87 were Italians.
Yeah.
And so,
And we've talked about the irrigation in Alberta. Of course, it's southern Alberta. You know, the irrigation work, and a number of them worked there. And I'm sure that some of them would have moved on to do irrigation work in BC.
Did anybody have any other questions for Adriana? No. Okay. Well, I was going to do a little plug for the next sessions we have, but I see most of the people who are still on the call are all members of the club, so you've heard about it a lot. But Adriana, thanks so much for this. This was fascinating. You may have a true crime podcast there that you could do. But this was fascinating. On behalf of the Kelowna Canadian Italian Club, thank you so much for kicking off this series. We're at a few bugs that we're still kicking off, but as I said, this was recorded, so it will be available on demand on our website in a day or so. David, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, both Gord and Don, thank you very much for bringing this series to us. You know, bringing Italian heritage to the people is important, and it's been ignored for a long time. So thanks, and all that work that you're doing is getting recognition across the country. So you're doing a good job. And I love the series because it's got a wide range of topics, whether it be, you know, something more of an overview with agriculture or Italian dialects, or about interesting Canadian Italians, such as tonight's Emilio Picariello. So we're really proud of the work that you're both doing, and for bringing authors like Adriana to our club, and the fascinating stories. And Adriana, thanks for joining us tonight. I know authors spend years researching, crafting the story, and working on all the details, editing, selecting the right word, and then changing it back. So it's that attention to detail, though, that really makes a flawless story that's both interesting and informative. And you've obviously mastered that. And all those hours that you spent writing, we appreciate. And so you took time away from your life, your family, and friends to bring us a piece of Italian Canadian history. So thank you so much, Adriana.
Thanks so much, David. I see that Dawn is flashing my book.
yes,
you
we
know,
have a copy
so-
available for from our library. So our library is basically closed, but we have these books out of the library. So just give me a jingle, and there you go. We got a couple copies we can float around.
Good. And, you know, I can't wait to see, you know, the installments to do with the new research and discoveries that that you're making, and both virtual exhibits, you know, and also a physical exhibit, you know, that I'd love to come to at some point, because I think that you know, all of these stories are unique, and that you know, for many Italians in Alberta, whether it was the earliest times to the later times, I mean, the agricultural areas of BC were the Mecca. You know, that you could have your fruit trees and you could have your grapes and all of this. So, you know, this notion of BC as this incredibly desirable place, bountiful, you know, and that you're putting together that story. So I look forward, you know, to reading it very much.
Well, thank you. And tentatively, fall of 2023 is when that physical exhibit will be at the Kelowna Museum.
So that's a date then.
And thanks everyone for joining us. And we will let you get on with whatever exciting plans you have for the rest of the evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Diana.
Bye-bye.